The hull of the Zygorian warship vibrated with a low hum as Princess Valora Zar strode down its central corridor, her 7-foot frame casting a long shadow before her. Warriors and officers alike pressed themselves against the metallic walls, eyes downcast, careful to maintain the sacred 3-meter distance from her royal person. "Status report," she commanded, her voice carrying the characteristic dual-toned resonance of Zygorian royalty. Commander Drav, her most trusted officer, bowed deeply. "The human vessel has been captured intact, Your Highness. Minimal resistance. 5 survivors." Valora's silver eyes narrowed beneath her crystalline crown. "Survivors? I ordered no prisoners." "They surrendered immediately," Drav explained, his scaled skin shifting nervously from blue to a pale green. "And one of them appears to be a high-ranking scientist. Intelligence suggested extracting information before." "Fine." Valora cut him off with a gesture, the ceremonial gloves that covered her hands to her elbows glinting with embedded sensor tech. "Bring the scientist to the interrogation chamber." 20 minutes later, Valora observed the human through the one-way portal. He was shorter than she had expected, with skin the color of the sand dunes on Zygoria's third moon. Unlike many humans they'd encountered in their expansion through this sector, he displayed no obvious fear, merely a calm curiosity as he examined the geometric patterns etched into the chamber walls. "His name is Ethan Reed," Drav reported. "According to ship records, he specializes in xenobiology with a focus on evolutionary adaptation to deep space." "Interesting," Valora murmured. "A scientist who ventures into contested territory must either be very brave or very foolish." She entered the chamber, and the human looked up. His eyes, a startling blue, met hers directly, an act that would have earned any Zygorian an immediate death sentence. "You are either courageous or ignorant," she stated, remaining near the doorway. "Do you know who I am?" The human named Ethan straightened his posture but remained seated. "You're Princess Valora Zar of the Zygorian Empire. The untouchable." A flicker of surprise crossed her features. "You know our traditions." "I make it my business to understand the cultures I study," he replied. "No one may touch Zygorian royalty on pain of death. The isolation preserves your connection to your ancestors and maintains the purity of your decisions." Valora circled the room, maintaining her distance. "Then you understand your precarious position. Your vessel crossed into sovereign Zygorian space." "A navigation error," Ethan said calmly. "We were tracking a deep space anomaly that appeared to affect local gravity. The readings led us here." "Convenient," Valora replied. "And you surrendered rather than fought." For the first time, a small smile appeared on the human's face. "Fighting would have been inefficient. Your reputation precedes you, Princess. I've heard you've personally ended 17 boarding parties without a single weapon." Despite herself, Valora felt a hint of pride. 23, actually." An alarm suddenly blared through the chamber. Commander Drav's voice echoed over the comm, "Highness. Coalition forces detected. 3 warships approaching from Sector 7. Valora turned to leave when the human's voice stopped her. "Princess, my ship detected unusual energy fluctuations before we were captured. If the Coalition is using pulse cannons in this sector, your shields won't hold." She paused, studying him. "Why would you offer tactical advice to your captor?" "Because there are 5,000 civilians on this vessel according to your registry," Ethan said. "And Coalition pulse cannons don't discriminate." For a moment, the princess was silent, weighing his words against years of ingrained suspicion. Then she made a decision that would alter the course of 2 civilizations. "Bring him to the command deck," she ordered. "If he's lying, he'll die watching his allies fail. If he's telling the truth." She left the thought unfinished as she strode from the chamber, acutely aware of the human's measured footsteps following at a careful distance behind her. What neither of them knew was that this first encounter would be the beginning of a bond that would challenge everything Valora had been raised to believe about strength, vulnerability, and the impenetrable walls she had built around herself, walls that no one had dared approach until now. The command deck of the Zygorian warship pulsed with activity as officers hurried to battle stations. Valora stood at the elevated central platform, her crystalline crown reflecting the emergency lights that bathed the chamber in crimson. Coalition vessels closing, Highness. Their weapons systems are hot, reported Commander Drav, his scales now a deep battle purple. Ethan stood at the prescribed distance, hands clasped behind his back as he studied the holographic display. The fluctuation pattern matches pulse cannon signatures. Your standard shields will reconfigure to spectrum shifting defense pattern Tora 7, Valora commanded, cutting him off. Her officers exchanged glances. It was the exact protocol the human would have suggested. The ship rocked violently as the first volley struck. Valora remained perfectly balanced while officers stumbled. Only Ethan noticed the small device that broke free from an overhead compartment, hurtling directly toward the princess's exposed neck. Without thinking, he lunged forward, sweeping the jagged metal aside with his bare hand. His momentum carried him directly into Valora's personal space, his shoulder brushing against her arm as they both fell. Absolute silence crashed over the command deck. Every Zygorian froze, weapons instantly trained on the human. Blood dripped from Ethan's sliced palm onto the immaculate floor. Valora stood slowly, her silver eyes wide with shock, not just at the violation of sacred space, but at the absence of the revulsion she had been conditioned to expect. Instead, a strange warmth lingered where his shoulder had touched her. "Stand down," she ordered, her dual-toned voice unnaturally quiet. Commander Drav stepped forward. "Highness, the law is absolute. He prevented injury during battle," Valora interrupted sharply. "Tactical necessity. Return to your stations." Another blast rocked the ship, breaking the tension. "Their cannons are recalibrating," Ethan said, clutching his bleeding hand. "You have approximately 40 seconds to counterattack before they adjust to your shield frequency." Valora turned to her weapons officer. "Target their central power matrix with quantum torpedoes. Fire on my mark." She paused, then added, "And get the human to medical. We need his knowledge intact." Later, in the sterile confines of the medical bay, Valora watched from the doorway as a medical officer treated Ethan's wound. None of the staff questioned her presence, though many cast curious glances in her direction. "You knew our shields would adapt," she said finally. Ethan nodded, wincing as the regeneration field sealed his laceration. "I studied Zygorian technology extensively. Your adaptive defense systems are remarkable, but coalition forces have been developing countermeasures." "You've placed me in a difficult position," Valora said, pacing the limited space while maintaining her distance. "By law, you should be executed for contact with royal blood. Yet here I am," Ethan replied. "Why?" Valora stopped pacing. "Because you acted without hesitation to protect someone you've been taught to fear. It was unexpected." "I don't fear you," Ethan said simply. Her silver eyes narrowed. "Then you're either foolish or lying. Or I see more than a title." His blue eyes held hers steadily. "I see a leader who values her people above rigid tradition. You could have let those torpedoes hit your ship to maintain distance from coalition territory, but you chose to protect your crew instead." Before Valora could respond, Commander Drav appeared at the doorway, bowing deeply. "Highness, the Royal Council demands an audience regarding the incident." "Notify them I will connect when we reach secure space," she replied, then turned back to Ethan. "You will serve as cultural advisor until we determine what to do with you. Coalition diplomatic patterns have become increasingly erratic." "And in exchange?" Ethan asked. "You live," Valora replied, though her tone lacked its usual edge. In the days that followed, an unusual routine developed. Ethan would explain human diplomatic approaches while Valora taught him about Zygorian hierarchical structures. The required distance between them remained, but something else had changed. A boundary less visible than physical space had begun to weaken. During a strategic planning session, Ethan noticed Valora unconsciously rubbing her left temple, a gesture he'd observed whenever she was fatigued. In human culture, he said carefully, touch is used for healing. Certain pressure points can relieve pain. We have medical technology for that, she replied stiffly. Of course, Ethan nodded. But technology cannot replace all forms of connection. Valora studied him for a long moment. Is that what humans seek? Connection? It's what all sentient beings seek, in different ways, Ethan answered. Even those who build walls around themselves. For the first time in her life, Valora wondered if the sacred distance that defined her existence might be less a form of protection and more a form of prison, one she had never questioned until a human dared to breach its boundaries. The Great Hall of Judgment loomed before Ethan, its towering obsidian pillars etched with the history of 1,000 Zygorian victories. He stood alone on the circular platform in the center, surrounded by tiered seating where the royal council, 12 elders whose crystalline crowns glinted like cold stars, looked down upon him with undisguised suspicion. Valora sat upon an elevated throne, her expression unreadable. By tradition, she could not speak during the trial of loyalty until all evidence had been presented. Human Ethan Reed, intoned Lord Kresix, the eldest counselor, his scales a pale, weathered blue. You stand accused of manipulating our princess through your foreign influence. You have violated sacred boundaries and now hold dangerous knowledge of our defenses and weaknesses. Ethan squared his shoulders. I have shared knowledge freely in both directions, Lord Counselor. Knowledge that has already prevented bloodshed. Pretty words, hissed Lady Mevra, her reptilian features contorting. Yet we find the princess behaving most uncharacteristically since your arrival. A murmur rippled through the assembled Zygorian nobility who had gathered to witness the rare spectacle of an alien on trial. Many had traveled across systems just to glimpse the human who had somehow survived touching the untouchable. The trial of loyalty has 3 challenges, announced Lord Kresix. First, the challenge of knowledge, you must demonstrate understanding of our most sacred values. Second, the challenge of courage, you must face what you most fear without faltering. Third, the challenge of sacrifice, you must surrender what you hold most dear. Ethan nodded, his eyes briefly meeting Valoris. He had spent weeks studying Zygorian culture under her guidance, learning not just their tactical systems but the philosophical underpinnings of their society. For the challenge of knowledge, Lord Kresix continued, explain why no one may touch the royal bloodline. Ethan took a deep breath. The prohibition against royal touch is not, as many outsiders believe, about superiority or contamination. It is about connection, to ancestry and to the future. Each royal carries within them the collected wisdom of all who came before, passed through bloodline memory. Physical contact creates neural interference patterns that can disrupt this connection, potentially causing the loss of ancestral guidance. The council members exchanged surprised glances. What then, asked Lady Mevra skeptically, is the purpose of the royal gloves? They serve dual functions, Ethan replied. They protect the neural pathways carrying ancestral memory while simultaneously gathering sensory data that would normally come through touch. The crown processes this data, allowing royals to experience the world fully without risking disconnection from their lineage. A heavy silence fell over the hall. He speaks as if born to our ways, whispered one counselor. Or as if carefully coached, countered another. Lord Kresix raised a gnarled hand. For the challenge of courage, you will face the memory chamber. It will extract and manifest your deepest fears. Guards led Ethan to a small, spherical room adjacent to the hall. The door sealed behind him with a hiss, and the walls began to shimmer and pulse. Suddenly, he was no longer in the chamber but floating in the vacuum of space, his oxygen rapidly depleting, the nightmare that had haunted him since a near-fatal accident during his first deep space expedition. From the observation window, Valora watched his vital signs spike dangerously as he struggled against the hallucination. Her hands clenched involuntarily, the sensor tech in her gloves registering her elevated stress. Inside the chamber, Ethan forced himself to remember this wasn't real. He closed his eyes, focusing on his breathing, recalling Valora's teachings about Zygorian meditation techniques. Gradually, his heart rate stabilized. When he opened his eyes again, he faced the hallucination calmly until it dissolved around him. When he emerged, even Lady Mevra looked impressed. For the final challenge, Lord Krezix announced, the challenge of sacrifice, you must surrender your research, all knowledge you have gathered about our people. Ethan looked surprised. My research is already yours. I've withheld nothing. Not the research in your possession, clarified Lord Krezix. The research in your mind. You will undergo memory extraction. All knowledge of Zygorian biology, technology, and culture will be removed. A heavy silence fell over the hall. Memory extraction often left subjects with significant cognitive damage. Ethan's gaze found Valora, who had risen to her feet, clearly preparing to intervene despite tradition. I accept, Ethan said quickly, before she could speak. With one condition. I ask to keep my memories of Zygorian philosophy and art, not the tactical knowledge, but the cultural understanding that has enriched my perspective. The council conferred in hushed tones. Granted, Lord Krezix finally announced. But all strategic knowledge must be surrendered. As the extraction technicians approached, Valora finally broke protocol. I invoke sovereign privilege, she declared, her dual-toned voice resonating through the hall. As heir to the throne, I claim this human as a royal resource. His mind remains intact under my protection. Gasps echoed through the chamber. Sovereign privilege hadn't been invoked in 7 generations. You would risk ancestral disconnection for this alien? Lady Mevra demanded. Valora's silver eyes were steady. He has demonstrated knowledge of our ways, courage in the face of fear, and willingness to sacrifice for our people. Are these not the very values we hold sacred? Perhaps our ancestors would counsel us that isolation has served its purpose, and a new era of selective connection would strengthen rather than weaken us. As the council erupted in debate, Ethan and Valora shared a glance across the hall, still separated by the prescribed distance, yet somehow closer than either had ever been to another being. The royal gardens of the Zygorian palace ship offered a rare glimpse of beauty amid the military precision that defined the empire. Bioluminescent plants from a dozen worlds cast their soft glow across winding paths, creating islands of colored light in the artificial night cycle. Valora stood beside a flowering Terran orchid, watching as Ethan carefully adjusted its nutrient feed. Since his trial 3 weeks earlier, he had been granted unprecedented freedoms, including tending to the xenobotanical collection he'd helped expand with specimens from his own research. The council's acceptance was unexpected, Valora admitted, her dual-toned voice softer than usual in the garden's peaceful atmosphere. Ethan smiled without looking up from his work. Your invocation of sovereign privilege was more unexpected. I'm told some counselors are still in shock. It was logical, she replied, though both knew it had been anything but. Your knowledge is valuable to the Empire. Just my knowledge? Ethan asked, finally looking up to meet her silver eyes. Before she could answer, her royal communicator pulsed with an urgent signal. Commander Drav's holographic form appeared between them, his scales a troubled gray. Highness, we've detected unauthorized transmissions originating from within the palace ship. Security has traced them to the human quarters. Valora's expression hardened instantly. Explain. Encrypted data packets sent during sleep cycles for the past month. Our cryptologists just broke the code, they contain detailed information about our defenses, shield modulations, and... Drav hesitated, your daily movements, Highness. The silence between them crystallized into something sharp and cold. That's impossible, Ethan said, his voice steady despite the accusation. I've sent no transmissions. The evidence has been verified, human, Drav replied. The transmission signature matches Coalition intelligence protocols. Valora's posture had changed completely, regal distance replacing the almost comfortable proximity they had developed. Have security escort the human to containment. Full isolation protocols. As guards materialized from the garden shadows, Ethan made no move to resist. Valora, I need you to listen. I was originally sent to gather intelligence, that much is true. But I abandoned that mission weeks ago. You admit to being a spy. The betrayal in her voice was raw despite her attempt at regal detachment. I was. I'm not anymore. His blue eyes held hers as the guards surrounded him. Think about it, why would I send information about shield modulations I helped improve? Why would I betray defenses I personally strengthened? For a moment, doubt flickered across Valora's features. Then she turned away. Take him. Hours later, alone in her private chambers, Valora paced the perimeter, the same measured distance she always maintained from others, now feeling both excessive and insufficient. The evidence against Ethan was damning, transmissions originating from his quarters, using his access codes, containing information only he could have compiled. Yet something felt wrong. The Coalition's sudden interest in her movements. The convenient timing just as the Council had begun to accept Ethan's presence. Her royal datapad chimed with a message from Lord Krezik's, emergency council session called. Coalition forces detected approaching outer defenses. Deliberation on the humans' execution scheduled before battle stations. Valora's hand hovered over the glowing acceptance indicator when another alert flashed, a security breach in the central database. Someone was accessing restricted files from within the royal wing. Silently, she made her way through hidden passages known only to the royal bloodline, emerging behind a concealed panel in the main security hub. There, hunched over the central console, was not Ethan but Lady Mevra, her scaled fingers rapidly transferring data to an external device. Counselor, Valora said coldly, explain yourself. Lady Mevra spun around, her shock quickly transforming into a sly smile. Princess. How inconvenient. You framed the human, Valora stated, the pieces falling into place. You sent the transmissions using his access codes. The human was changing things too quickly, Mevra hissed. Centuries of tradition, questioned because of an alien's influence. The Coalition offered a significant arrangement for your capture, they believe you're the only thing standing between them and Zygorian surrender. Treason, then, Valora said, her hand moving toward the emergency alert on her wrist. Mevra was faster. A concealed weapon discharged, the energy blast catching Valora in the shoulder. She staggered but remained standing. I had hoped the Coalition would simply eliminate you in battle, Mevra said, advancing with her weapon. But this works too. The Council will blame your death on the human spy. Before Mevra could fire again, the doors to the security hub burst open. Ethan stood in the entrance, flanked by Commander Drav and a security team. Transmission origin point confirmed, Highness, Drav reported, his weapon trained on Lady Mevra. The Counselor's personal encryption signature was found embedded in the data packets. How did you escape containment? Mevra snarled at Ethan. I didn't need to, he replied calmly. The princess never sent me there. Valora straightened despite her injury. I ordered your escort to the medical bay for a full neural scan. I needed proof of your innocence, or guilt, before the Council could act. As security officers surrounded Mevra, Valora approached Ethan, stopping just short of the traditional distance. You said you were sent as a spy originally. Why tell me this now? Because starting something new requires ending something old, he answered. I couldn't build trust while maintaining a lie. Alarms suddenly blared throughout the ship. Commander Drav's communicator flashed urgent signals. Coalition forces have breached the outer defenses, Highness. They're targeting the Royal Docking Bay. It's a capture mission. They're coming for me, Valora realized. Mevra told them exactly where to strike. As they rushed toward the command deck, Ethan kept pace beside her. I need to know, he said urgently. Do you trust me now? Valora met his gaze, the distance between them suddenly feeling like the true illusion. Yes, she answered simply. I do. Neither of them knew how much that trust would be tested in the battle to come. The command deck of the Zygorian flagship shuddered under successive coalition energy blasts. Emergency lights cast everything in harsh red shadows as officers frantically worked to maintain critical systems. Shields at 27%, reported the tactical officer, his scales paling with stress. They're concentrating fire on our starboard defense grid. Valora stood at the command platform, her injured shoulder hastily treated but still causing her visible pain. Ethan worked at a secondary console, analyzing coalition attack patterns. It's a hurting maneuver, he called out. They're not trying to destroy the ship, they're forcing us toward their capture vessels. Commander Drav confirmed the assessment. Tractor beam systems detected powering up in Sector 4. Divert all auxiliary power to forward shields, Valora ordered. Prepare for emergency jump to. A massive explosion rocked the ship, throwing everyone off balance. Status panels flashed critical warnings as a section of the ceiling collapsed near the central platform. Valora narrowly avoided being crushed, but the effort sent her stumbling against a damaged console. Electrical energy surged through her body, and she crumpled to the deck. Highness! Drav shouted, rushing to her side but stopping at the prescribed distance, helpless to render aid without violating sacred law. Ethan didn't hesitate. He pushed past shocked officers and knelt beside Valora's unconscious form. Her breathing was shallow, pulse erratic. She's going into neural shock, he announced. The electrical surge is interfering with her neural pathways. You cannot touch her, Drav warned, though his voice lacked conviction as he watched his princess dying before him. If I don't, she dies, Ethan countered, already removing his outer jacket. The electrical discharge has disrupted the connection to her ancestral memories. Without stabilization, that connection will be permanently severed. The command deck fell silent despite the battle raging around them. Every Zygorian present understood the significance. Loss of ancestral connection was considered a fate worse than death for royalty. What can you do? Drav asked finally. My research on Zygorian neural pathways might help, Ethan replied, rolling up his sleeves. But I need direct contact to create a bioelectric countercurrent. After a moment of hesitation, Drav nodded grimly. Save her. Ethan carefully removed Valora's ceremonial gloves, an action so forbidden that several officers turned away, unable to watch. Her scaled hands were a lighter silver than the rest of her skin, sensitive and never before exposed to open air. With steady movements, Ethan placed his palms against hers, creating a connection. He closed his eyes, concentrating on generating the specific bioelectric frequency that his research suggested would stabilize Zygorian neural pathways. Medical team to the command deck, Drav ordered, his voice strained as he watched the human violate their most sacred taboo in full view of the crew. Long minutes passed as the ship continued to take fire. Ethan remained focused, sweat beading on his forehead as he maintained the neural connection. Finally, Valora's eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first, then widening as she registered the warm hands pressed against her own. What have you done? She whispered, her dual-toned voice weak. What was necessary, Ethan replied softly. Your neural pathways were collapsing. Before she could respond, the medical team arrived and took over her care. As they worked, Drav approached Ethan, his expression grave. "You understand that by our most ancient laws, your action demands execution," he said quietly. "I do," Ethan nodded. "And I would make the same choice again." 3 days later, Valora stood before the full Royal Council in the Great Hall. The coalition attack had been repelled after her emergency strategy, implemented by Commander Drav during her incapacitation, had successfully trapped their capture vessels in a quantum field. "The human violated our most sacred law," Lord Kresik stated, his ancient voice echoing through the chamber. "The penalty is absolute." Valora, still recovering but standing tall, removed her ceremonial gloves, a gesture that sent gasps rippling through the assembly. "When I awoke after the human's intervention," she began, "I feared my ancestral connection would be severed. Instead, I found it stronger. Clearer." She held up her bare hands for all to see. "For generations, we have believed that royal touch would weaken us, disconnecting us from our ancestors' wisdom. We were wrong." Murmurs of shock and outrage filled the hall. "Our isolation was never about protection," Valora continued. "It was about control. Our ancestors speak to me now more clearly than ever before, and they tell me that connection, not separation, is our true strength." "This is heresy," Lady Sorith, who had replaced the treasonous Mevra, protested. "This is evolution," Valora countered. "The human's touch didn't sever my connection, it enhanced it. Touch doesn't disrupt neural pathways, it creates new ones. We have denied ourselves the very thing that would make us stronger." She turned to where Ethan stood, awaiting judgment. "The human before you committed no crime. He saved not only my life but the future of our people." Lord Kresik looked troubled. "You propose we abandon a tradition that has defined our civilization for millennia?" "I propose we grow beyond it," Valora replied. "Starting today, I revoke the law of untouchable status. Royal blood will no longer be isolated from those they lead." As the council erupted in debate, Valora approached Ethan. For the first time, she stopped not at the traditional distance but directly before him. "You risked everything," she said quietly. "Some things are worth the risk," he replied. Slowly, deliberately, she extended her hand, bare, vulnerable, offered freely. After a moment of hesitation, Ethan took it in his own. Throughout the great hall, Zagorians watched in astonishment as their untouchable princess made her choice. It wasn't just a touch that passed between them, but a promise, that walls built by fear could fall to courage, that distance mandated by tradition could be bridged by understanding, and that sometimes the most powerful revolution begins with the simplest connection. As her fingers interlaced with his, Valora finally understood why no one had ever dared to touch her before this human. It wasn't just fear of law or tradition that had kept others at a distance, it was the profound transformation that such connection would inevitably bring. Some boundaries, once crossed, could never be restored. And sometimes, that was exactly as it should be.